said that in every encounter, ICE agents have done exactly what they should do under the law, and that these are targeted operations and that everything is done correctly. And she was asked, I believe it was by NBC's Peter Alexander, if when these ICE agents go up to protesters and ask for their papers, whether that is considered a targeted operation and whether people should be bringing their papers with them and their ID. And she said, yes, U.S. citizens should be prepared to provide proof. So I want to bring in Ellie Honig to get some more context and perspective on what we just heard from the DHS secretary. You know, Ellie, we were just talking about yesterday protected First Amendment activity. And so I wonder what you make of the DHS secretary's claim there that when these ICE agents go up to protesters and ask for their papers, that is all above board, and that Americans should bring their papers with them to show proof.
Well, Pam, that's wrong. It's illegal and it's unconstitutional to require people to show their citizenship papers without some other basis to make a stop. So let me be clear. In order to stop somebody, detain them, question them for immigration purposes, an officer has to have reasonable suspicion. Now, that's a fairly low bar. It's lower than the bar that a law enforcement agent would need to make a stop or questioning for criminal purposes, but it's still a bar. It's not nothing. In fact, just a few months ago, in September of 2025, Justice Brett Kavanaugh wrote a concurring opinion in a Supreme Court case when he reiterated that, yes, immigration agents do have to have reasonable suspicion to stop somebody, to detain them, even briefly, and to question them. So what you cannot do is just go arbitrarily up to people or set up a checkpoint or go door to door and say, hey, you need to prove to us that you're a U.S. citizen. The immigration officer needs to have some reasonable suspicion, articulable, meaning something you can explain in words to a court. Why did you stop this person? And Justice Kavanaugh gave immigration officers very broad latitude to do that. But even he reconfirmed just a few months ago that there is a bar. You have to show reasonable suspicion. You cannot just arbitrarily approach people and make them prove that they are in fact here legally.
Well, let me just follow up on that, because you heard the DHS secretary say, well, if someone is standing there around a targeted operation or an arrest, that these agents have every right to ask for their ID and their papers. I mean, does that justify a reasonable suspicion if someone is standing there around an operation?
That is quite a stretch. Why would standing around an ICE operation tend to indicate that somebody is in this country illegally? I think that'd be a really hard one to justify in a court. And look, Justice Kavanaugh said it was controversial. Justice Kavanaugh actually said immigration officers, it's okay for them to look at things like the color of the person's skin, the language the person is speaking, where they are, if they're at a Home Depot or a car wash. So even if you allow that level of breadth in determining reasonable suspicion, how would standing around an ICE operation be any indicator of where a person's from or what their immigration status is? Yeah,
basically, she was saying that everyone, U.S. citizens, non-citizens, everyone should walk around with documentation, who they are, ID, and if they're citizens, their citizenship papers or their passport, for example. That's a pretty huge demand. Of the American people right now. But there's another huge development that's breaking right now, and I want to get your legal assessment. If the President of the United States invokes what's called the Insurrection Act, he would be able to deploy military forces to any city in the United States, and he would be able to activate the state National Guard troops as well, right?
Yeah, well, so the key thing to understand about the Insurrection Act is it is extremely broad, and it gives the president very broad discretion and authority. In fact, it's been criticized for many, many years for exactly that. The Insurrection Act allows the president, even if a governor does not want it, allows a president to activate the military, not just the National Guard, but the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, in either of basically two situations. One, if the president determines that there's an insurrection or rebellion, but two, way more broadly, if the president determines that it's necessary to enforce federal laws and to protect the civil rights or constitutional rights of civilians. So that second clause can mean almost anything, and that's why there's been concern about the breadth and scope of this Insurrection Act for a very long time. But the most important thing to understand, you don't actually need an insurrection as a normal person might understand that word. You don't need a rebellion in order to invoke the Insurrection Act. It gives the president the authority to call out the military to conduct law enforcement, which ordinarily they cannot do, if the president deems it necessary to enforce federal law.
So just to put this in perspective, because you have Governor Walz of Minnesota say that he has gotten the National Guard ready to go. But if the president did invoke this, then that would preempt what the governor could potentially do as it relates to the National Guard. Is that right?
Well, I think it would be in addition to the National Guard. What would happen if it played out that way? Governor Walz could deploy the Minnesota National Guard, and then President Trump would have to decide, okay, now that the National Guard has been deployed, is it still necessary to send in the military to enforce federal law? And Pam, I want to just give our viewers some historical reference points here. So the Insurrection Act has not been invoked since 1992 in the wake of the LA riots, and that was done at the request of a governor. President Bush agreed, but there you had consent and a request from the governor of California. The last time a president invoked the Insurrection Act without a request from a governor, you have to go back to the civil rights era, the late 1950s, early 1960s, when President Dwight Eisenhower, JFK, and Lyndon Johnson all at various points invoked the Insurrection Act to enforce Brown versus Board of Education. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that desegregation had to come to the land, that the era of segregation had to end, that our schools had to be desegregated, and some southern states and cities resisted that. And some southern states and cities even called out their National Guard to block students from coming in. Most famously, President Eisenhower in 1957 called out the 101st Airborne of the U.S. Army to escort 9 students into Little Rock High School. So that's the type of thing where we've invoked the Insurrection Act in the past, for historical reference there.
Very helpful. As Wolf always says, you know your stuff, Ellie.
He does.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.